I remember the way the morning light touched the garden walls the first day I arrived in Roseley. It was a quiet countryside village not far from Bath, with fields stretching out beyond the trees and an old stone church at the center of the town. The house I moved into was large, with white shutters and ivy climbing up the sides. It belonged to my aunt, Lady Agnes Fairley. Agnes was my late mother's older sister. She had lived in Roseley for more than 30 years. People in the village called her the elegant widow. Even at 73, she dressed carefully and walked with her chin lifted, like someone who expected others to listen. When my parents died in a car accident, she wrote to me in her usual short way and invited me to come and live with her. I had nowhere else to go, so I said yes. Her son, Edward, also lived in the house. He was 36, only a few years older than me. Edward was quiet and polite, with kind blue eyes and a soft voice. He worked as a solicitor in Bath and took the train every morning. He never married and hardly spoke of love or plans for the future. I think he spent his life making sure our aunt was pleased with him. At first, I felt lucky to be there. The house was beautiful, and the rooms were full of warm colors, soft carpets, and rare books. The windows looked out over flower beds, and in the evenings, the three of us sat by the fireplace drinking tea. Agnes liked soft lighting and calm music. She said it made her feel younger, and I noticed she never allowed any sharp lights in the room when she was there. She often talked about her younger days in London. She used to be an opera singer before she married my uncle, Lord Richard Fairley. He died years ago, and she never spoke much about him. My time on the stage, she used to say with a little laugh, was when I truly lived. Sometimes I wondered if she missed the lights or the applause more than the man. I lived in the guest flat just behind the garden, above what had once been the stables. The little place was cold in the mornings, but peaceful. I could walk to the main house in 2 minutes, and sometimes I sat by the back windows, watching the house from across the garden. I often saw Edward and Agnes having tea together, talking in low voices. He always smiled at her like a good son, and she always seemed pleased with herself. After a few weeks, I realized that something about Agnes's calm smile felt too perfect. She asked about my clothes, my walk, and even the way I held my fork. She said, "We must not let bad habits grow in this house." But it was never clear what she meant. Slowly, I began to feel watched. Everything I did, she noticed. I tried not to mind. I wanted her to like me, and I was grateful for the roof over my head. But sometimes, when I saw her touch Edward's cheek like he was still a boy, I felt a strange sadness. She looked at him, not just with love, but with control. It was like he belonged to her more than to himself. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Agnes spoke about her son's childhood. "Edward never caused me any trouble," she said with pride. "Not like some boys who run off with silly girls." Edward looked into his teacup. I noticed the way his hand held the spoon tightly. He didn't speak, and neither did I. In the daytime, when Edward was away at work, I helped with the garden. Agnes liked fresh flowers on the table, and I enjoyed walking among the roses. One afternoon in early June, the sun was strong and the garden smelled of lavender. I decided to lie down on the flat roof of the old stables behind the house, where the sunlight felt soft and no one could see me. I took a blanket and a book, planning to rest for an hour. As I closed my eyes, I heard something strange. A soft voice, like a whisper, floated up from below. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard words, clear and slow. "Frederick, it wasn't my fault," the voice said. "You were too weak. She would have broken your heart. I saved you." I opened my eyes. My heart was beating fast. There was no one on the roof, and I was completely alone. I sat up and listened. The voice came again. "You left, but I stayed. I had to protect what was mine." It was Aunt Agnes's voice, but it sounded different. Softer, lower, almost dreamy. I looked around in confusion. Then I saw a narrow pipe near the edge of the roof, where the old rainwater drain ran down into the wall. I bent closer and realized the sound was coming from there. Her voice was rising up from the garden below. For a few minutes I sat frozen. Was she speaking to someone? Or was she simply thinking aloud? The name she mentioned, Frederick, was not familiar to me. She never spoke of anyone by that name. I lay still, listening, and felt a strange coldness move through my chest. Agnes continued talking to the air as if answering questions only she could hear. "She loved you, yes," she said. "But she didn't know you. I did. I saw how she looked at you. With her soft lies and empty dreams." The words frightened me. They didn't sound like a memory. They sounded like a confession. I stayed on the roof for another 10 minutes, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't forget the sound of her voice. There was something in it. Not sadness, but pride. That evening, as always, we sat in the drawing room. Agnes looked as elegant as ever, her hair softly curled, her dress the color of deep plum. She smiled at Edward and asked about his work. Nothing in her face showed guilt or worry, but I knew what I had heard. The next day, I returned to the roof. I didn't plan to spy. I simply needed to know more. I waited in silence, eyes closed, trying to let the warm sun relax me. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as I was about to leave, the voice returned. "He reminds me of Richard. That calmness, that softness. But he doesn't have my fire." This time she was speaking about Edward. I was sure of it. I held my breath as she continued. "He'll never love a girl who isn't like me. Not unless I let him." I couldn't stay. I climbed down, my legs shaking. Something in me had changed. I no longer saw Agnes as simply proud or difficult. I saw the truth now. She had shaped every part of Edward's life. She had decided who he could love and who he must forget. And worse, she didn't even feel guilty. That night, I stood in the garden and watched the lights go out in her bedroom window. Edward stayed in the drawing room alone, looking tired. I wanted to go to him, to tell him what I had heard, but I didn't have the courage yet. Not then. I turned back toward my flat, but before I left, I whispered something to the dark sky. I will find a way to free him. Over the next few days, I kept my distance. I went to the village library in the afternoons and took long walks by the river. I didn't want Agnes to sense that something had changed, but in truth, everything had. I saw her in a new way now. Before, I thought she was simply proud, maybe lonely. But now I understood how deep her control went. She didn't just guide Edward's life. She shaped it, twisted it, and held it close like it belonged to her. That weekend, the village had its summer fair. Edward offered to take me, and I said yes. It was the first time he and I were alone together outside the house. We walked past little stalls selling sweets and handmade soaps. He bought me a cup of tea, and we sat on a bench under a tree. "It's nice to see you smile," he said gently. "I worry sometimes that Rosalie might be a bit dull." I shook my head. "It's peaceful here. I like peaceful things." He looked at the ground for a moment. "Do you think peace is the same as happiness?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about Agnes, her calm voice, her quiet control. "No," I said softly. "I think real peace comes when you're free." Edward looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something uncertain, maybe even afraid. Later that evening, after Agnes went to bed early, Edward and I sat in the garden. The moon was high, and the air smelled of roses. "I used to think I would marry someone by now," he said. "I had hopes, but they never lasted." "Why not?" I asked. "She didn't approve," he said simply. "She had reasons. She always does." I could feel my heart beating faster. "Do you still want that? To love someone?" He didn't speak for a while. Then he looked at me. "Yes, but I don't know how to begin." I reached for his hand. It was warm and still. "Then start here," I said. From that evening on, something shifted between us. It was not loud or sudden. It was soft, like the light in Agnes's drawing room. Always gentle, always quiet. But it was there. We began walking together in the mornings before he caught the train. In the evenings, we shared stories over tea when Agnes went to bed early. We never spoke of love directly, but we didn't need to. One afternoon, I found an old wooden box in the guest flat's closet. It was pushed far back behind a coat. Inside were photographs, black and white, faded around the edges. Some were of Richard Fairley, my late uncle. Others showed a young Agnes standing beside a man I didn't recognize. There was a name written in ink on the back of one photo. Frederick. I felt cold again. That was the name I had heard through the drain pipe. I studied the man's face. He was handsome in a strong, serious way. There was something gentle in his eyes, something that didn't belong in Agnes's world. Next to the photos was a small notebook. I opened it slowly, afraid of what I might find. Inside were a few pages written in neat, old handwriting. They were love letters, but not sent. They had never been posted. All were addressed to Frederick. I had to choose. One line read, "You or the future? You or the name?" I chose the name. She had loved him. That much was clear. But she left him behind to marry into a title, into power, into silence. I put the notebook back in the box and closed it. I sat on the floor thinking, how many lives had she broken, including her own, to keep her image clean? The next morning, I decided to climb back onto the roof. I waited until the sun was high and Agnes had gone into the garden. I didn't want to listen again, but part of me needed to know. This time her voice came earlier, and it was colder. "He thinks he's falling in love," she said. "But he isn't. It's just kindness. He's always been kind." I held my breath. "She won't stay," she continued. "They never do. And if she does, I'll make her wish she hadn't." My hands began to shake. I stood up quickly and climbed down. That evening, I stayed in my flat and did not come to dinner. I told Edward I had a headache. He looked concerned, but he didn't push me. The next morning, I walked into the village alone and bought a small recorder. I placed it near the drain pipe before Agnes went outside for her sunbath. I waited on the roof as usual, pretending to read. I didn't want to hear the words. I only wanted to keep them. I knew I was doing something cruel, but it was not more cruel than the silence she had forced us all to live in. The recordings went on for a few days. Most were short. She spoke of old regrets, old lovers, and her fears about growing old and being forgotten. Then, one afternoon, her voice turned sharp. "I know what she's doing. I've seen the way he looks at her. She thinks she can win." There was a pause. "But she doesn't know what I've kept from him. If I told him the truth about his father, he'd break." My breath caught. "You were a secret," she said slowly, "but a beautiful one. I kept you in my heart while I built my life. And he never knew. He thought Richard was his father, but you were more than that. You were everything." That night, I sat with Edward on the stone bench in the garden. I wanted to tell him what I had heard, what I had recorded. But how could I? He loved her. Even now, even with all her coldness. Instead, I asked, "Did your mother ever talk about your father?" He shook his head. "Not much. Just that he was strong, quiet. They didn't seem to laugh together." I waited a long moment. Then I asked, "Did she ever speak about anyone named Frederick?" He looked up, confused. "Frederick? No. Why?" "No reason," I said quickly. "I saw the name in one of the old photo albums." He nodded slowly. It's strange. Sometimes I feel like there's a part of me I don't understand. Like something is missing. I wanted to take his hand, to tell him that it wasn't his fault. But I stayed quiet. Later that week, something in Agnes began to change. Her steps were slower, and she started forgetting things. Simple things like names and days. She refused to see a doctor and kept her bedroom curtains closed all day. Edward grew more worried. She isn't herself, he said. But maybe she never was. We spent more evenings in the garden now, watching the sky. I didn't know if he loved me, not fully, but he trusted me, and that was a beginning. One night, after she went to bed early, Edward touched my hand and said softly, "Do you think love can grow in silence?" I answered, "It already has." Summer began to turn into autumn. The evenings came earlier, and the garden lost some of its color. Agnes stopped coming down to dinner. She said she was too tired. Edward visited her room every night, bringing her tea and checking that she had taken her medicine. I stayed away. I didn't feel welcome there anymore. One morning, Edward asked me to go into the study and find one of his mother's old letters. He said it was part of some legal papers she wanted to update. I went in and opened the top drawer of her desk. It was filled with perfectly organized folders and small boxes. Everything had a label. Her handwriting was thin and sharp, like the lines she had drawn around all of our lives. I found a red envelope with gold edges. It had no name on it. I opened it carefully. Inside were 3 sheets of thick paper. It was her will. I didn't mean to read it. I only wanted to make sure I had found the right document. But my eyes caught a line near the middle, and I couldn't stop. To my dear son, Edward Fairley, I leave the sum of £1,000. My breath stopped. That was all. Just one sentence. £1,000. To my niece, Mira Langdon, I leave £100. She has shown me polite company but little understanding. I felt the paper shake in my hands. Then came the final line. The remainder of my estate shall be given to the Roseley Art Institute. My name will remain in its halls and its work. This is my final gift to the world. I closed the envelope and placed it back in the drawer. My heart felt tight and slow. I had not expected anything, but I had not expected cruelty either. That night, Edward and I sat together in the library. He had just come back from visiting his mother. His face was pale. "She told me something strange today," he said. "She said, 'I made you, and now you think you can unmake me.' What do you think that means?" I looked at him closely. "I think she knows you're pulling away." He gave a sad little smile. "I thought I was hiding it." "You're not," I said. "But maybe it's time she saw it." There was a long pause. Then he turned to me. "Mira, I don't know if love is enough, but I think what we have is something more than kindness. Something deeper." "It is," I said. And it's real, even if she never gave you the space to find it." He nodded. "Then let's hold on to it. Quietly, if we must. But let's not let her take it away." The next day, the weather changed. A heavy rain came in from the north, and the windows of the house were wet with gray light. Agnes stayed in her room, and Edward worked from home, answering calls and typing quietly in the library. In the afternoon, I went to the roof one last time. The sky was dark, and the wind pulled at my scarf. I didn't bring the recorder. I didn't need it anymore. As I sat there, watching the trees bend in the wind, I heard her voice again through the drain pipe. "It was always about control," she whispered. "Even Richard knew that. But he let me have it because he was weak. They all were. Except Frederick. He saw me." Her voice was tired now. Not sharp, not cruel. Just tired. I thought if I kept enough, I would never disappear. If I held everything, no one could leave. But they did. Even Jack. Even Frederick. The sound of rain covered the rest. I stood up, feeling the cold in my hands. I looked down at the wet garden and thought of all the quiet years that had passed here, held in her hands like pieces of string. Edward, trapped by duty. Me, nearly caught in the same net. That night, as the rain hit the windows, she came into the drawing room without warning. Her hair was loose. She wore a dark dress and no shoes. Her face was thin and sharp, but her eyes looked empty. "You think you've won," she said to both of us. "But you don't know what you're doing." Edward stood but didn't speak. She looked at him. "You will regret this. Love fades. Obedience is stronger." Then she turned to me. "And you think you're clever, but you're nothing without my roof." I met her eyes. "Then take your roof back." We didn't see her again after that night. She stayed in her room, and we let her. The doctor came twice, then stopped coming. She didn't want help. She refused medicine. She refused mirrors. One of the maids told us that she had asked for all the mirrors in her room to be removed. Edward grew quieter, but not broken. He began to smile again, even if only in small ways. We ate together in the kitchen, and we sat by the fire in silence that felt safe. Then, one morning in late October, the house was silent. The maid found her at sunrise. Her heart had failed. The doctor said she must have taken something too strong, something she had kept hidden, perhaps for this very moment. I felt cold when I heard the news, but not shocked. Agnes had always been in control, even of the end. That afternoon, Edward and I walked together to the village lawyer's office. The will was read aloud, word for word. I kept my eyes on Edward. He didn't move. His face didn't change. When it was over, we stepped outside. "She did it again," I said. He nodded. "But I don't feel anything." "I do," I said. "I feel free." We returned to the house. The air felt strange without her. Lighter, but also quieter. That evening we went through some of her old things. In her bedside drawer we found a small notebook. It was the same one I had seen before, filled with half-finished letters to Frederick. Edward read them slowly. I watched his face. "She did love him," he said. "But not enough to choose him," I answered. We sat by the fire that night and didn't speak much. The next morning, I left the recorder and the letters on Edward's desk. He would find them when he was ready. A week later, he knocked on my door. He didn't say anything. He just took my hand and held it for a long time. "I'm ready," he said finally. "To let her go?" I asked. "Yes," he whispered. "And to begin." He pulled me close. We stood in the quiet room, no voices above, no shadows in the walls. Agnes Fairley left behind a house full of silence and a name on a museum wall. But Edward and I carried nothing from her but the decision to begin again. In truth, not in fear. And for the first time in my life, I felt like the walls around me were mine.